Figure it out.
Hello, this is Adam Koralik from Figured Out Productions. The following video is a video of some kind, and I hope you enjoy it.
Hey guys, it's Adam here, and today we're going to be talking about a bunch of controllers by a company called Retro Fighters. So I've actually talked about these guys in the past, and I'm sure you guys have seen them as well in other people's videos and online and stuff. These guys are kind of making the rounds for a pretty basic idea, yet pretty smart one. There seems to be a large market of people, of gamers specifically, who would love to go back and play retro games, but they run into a familiar problem where their controllers are in bad shape, what have you, and they need new controllers. That's not new. But what these guys also did is they went to the next evolution of that, because there's also an entire generation of people who go back to retro consoles and realize, I don't know if I really can play those anymore because my hands have gotten too used to the modern design of a controller, namely a PlayStation controller or an Xbox 360 controller or Xbox One, etc. You get it. The wider type of controllers that we've gotten used to over the last couple of generations. Now, personally, I never had a problem going back and playing with an original N64 controller or anything like that, but I don't represent everybody. There's a lot of people who do feel that way, and Retro Fighters has introduced a way for people to kind of be able to get the best of all worlds here. So I've talked about them in the past, and I've actually done an entire video on this one. This is the Brawler 64. Now, this one is specifically for the N64 on actual hardware. And I actually really love this controller. My consensus to it was this is actually the way I prefer to play the N64 now. Not that I can't handle the original, Trident controller, but at the same time, I don't know, this was more comfortable. The only flaw I really had with it is I didn't think the thumbstick was quite as good, but aside from that, I thought this was a solid controller all around. And I've also shown this in the past. This is the Retro Fighters controller for the NES. Now, this looks really complicated for the NES, considering it just had a D-pad start, select, B and A. So what this does is it actually replicates different parts of the controller through multiple sequences. That way, depending on whatever game you're playing, you can kind of, adjust accordingly. So A and B is also replicated in the form of, the thumbsticks, etc. But yeah, or the D-pad and the triggers, etc. So it's just another way to be able to interact with the NES. And this is actually, again, the way I prefer to play the NES. This particular controller also has a USB cable. What they decided to do later on was separate these things. So the N64 one was specifically for the N64, but they did this. They released the Brawler 64 USB based. Now this version happens to work on PC, Mac, and Switch. It's exactly the same controller, it just happens to work on those platforms instead. As I don't really game on PC, I won't get as much out of that. This would be more, for me, it would be more for the Switch. Especially any sort of N64 collection or anything like that that ever comes about, I'll be ready to go when it comes to that. And then we have a couple of these. I should have said this earlier in the video, though. All of these were sent to me for the purposes of review for free from Castlemania Games. So I want to thank them, or Ryan specifically, for doing that. That was really cool of him to do. And the people at Retro Fighters for just, making this stuff, because I think it's neat that this gets to exist. Now, that said, we have two versions of what look like they're the same controller, and they basically are, but again, similar concept to the Brawler 64. We have the BrawlerGen. Now, the one on the right here is the USB-based one. This one was actually specifically designed for the Genesis Mini. It says it right there on the top. I have the Genesis Mini right there. It would work right on that, but it also works on PC, Mac, and Switch. So this would actually be pretty useful if you wanted to play like the Sega Genesis collection that Sega put out for the Switch, or whatever, games you feel like playing on there. But the one that I'm the most excited about, since I typically stick with original hardware in most cases, is this, the BrawlerGen. This one is specifically designed for not only the Genesis, but the Saturn. So it actually works on both, and I think that that's just really cool. And that's what we're primarily going to dive into, because like I said, I already did review the Brawler 64, and essentially this is the same controller, it's just a different output. So we're going to focus most of our efforts on this one. There is a Dreamcast version of this controller coming up in the future, and you can be sure that I'm going to definitely be covering that. That'll be right there in my Keep Dreaming series. But for now, this little stopgap here will be the BrawlerGen. So let's go ahead and take a look at it and open it up. So back there, very simple, basic case, and inside we have the controller. We have a little manual and a keychain. Interesting, I wasn't expecting any sort of keychain. Just says Retro Fighters and shows like a little character. That's cool. And then it just has, instructions about it. Now, taking a look at the controller itself, unfortunately it looks like the plastic bubble part here got destroyed at some point, but it doesn't matter. It seems like the controller itself is totally fine. Holding it, first impressions, comfortable enough for what it is for a Sega Genesis or Sega Saturn controller. I would have to sit there and, I'm going to obviously do some, serious play down time and just see kind of what I think of it. One thing that's interesting about this, though, especially if you're using the USB-based version, is one thing that people were complaining about with the Genesis Mini over there is that Sega included the original, like, 3-button controllers, and a lot of people wanted the 6-button controller, A, because they prefer it, and B, because some games require it, or at least are substantially better with it. So this is not a perfect solution, but if you end up liking this controller better than the Genesis controllers, because this has all 6 buttons, it does solve that problem. But noting on this particular controller, one thing I think it's interesting is that they did in fact include the thumbstick on there. The thumbstick is, I mean, this gets into like obscure-ish kind of territory here, but the thumbstick only served a purpose on the Sega Saturn, and barely. No Genesis game would have ever used this, at least not in its original form. The Sega Saturn did have what was known as the 3D controller, and that actually did have a thumbstick. That controller clearly inspired and eventually moved on to become the Dreamcast controller. But yeah, that controller was designed for some games, and the only one they ever really promoted for that console to use that controller and use that thumbstick was Nights into Dreams. So in a way, you can almost argue that Retro Fighters put this on here for Nights into Dreams and the Nights into Dreams alone. I doubt they would actually agree with that, but it's probably not really the case, but it's kind of interesting to see that they actually did include that for essentially one game. But obviously it would work on other things. So pushing it here, buttons seem good. The C button seems to stick a little bit. I'm going to have to see if that's... No, never mind. I take that back. It seems fine. So yeah, it's comfortable enough, and so far so good. I'm going to have to take a look at it and plug it in and everything and see what I think from there. Now, like I said on the back, it has 2 ports output. So it's got the Genesis, as mentioned before, which would also include 32X compatibility as well as Sega CD compatibility, and then it has a separate port here for the Sega Saturn. So I guess that was the easiest way to do it. Now, funny enough, on the back, the sticker is actually inaccurate. It says Retro Fighters BrawlerGen USB gamepad, which would be the same thing that would be on this one, I presume, but they just didn't update this sticker, so they obviously just changed the wiring. I mean, I guess that logically is all you have to do, but funny that the sticker itself is not actually accurate, but not that it really matters all that much. Okay, so I've been playing with this thing for a little while now, and it's time for final thoughts. Now, here's the thing. What I was hoping for in this controller was an experience that updates both the Genesis and the Sega Saturn, essentially bringing something new to the table and making me feel like retro content is new again. The Retro Fighters controller for the NES did that. For the N64, it did that. With this one, with the BrawlerGen, it's kind of a mixed bag. So we'll start with the obvious. It's in the name, Gen. It's for Genesis. That's really what they focused on, at least from a marketing standpoint, and we'll get back to that. I played with this thing with the Sega Genesis as well as the Sega CD and the 32X, confirming that it works across all 3. Not that there was any reason to think it wouldn't, but it does. And I tried various games, some that support the 6 buttons, some that don't, and some just games I'm very familiar with, and others that I wasn't as familiar with, just trying to see like what happens. Now here's the thing. The thumbstick would be the most obvious new thing that could be potentially useful when playing with this controller, except with the Genesis it's really not. Because the thing with the Genesis was every game on that console was made with the intention of using the D-pad. The only exceptions to that being ones that were for strange peripherals like a light gun, or in some cases even a mouse. Now, the mouse could actually be potentially useful with the thumbstick and the handful of games that actually use that. But aside from that, you're going to want to use the D-pad in almost all instances. The D-pad itself on this controller is definitely not better than the original D-pad. It's fine. It's just not, it's not better. But the thumbstick is much more sensitive than the D-pad. So in almost all cases, it's too hard to actually play a lot of the games. With the Genesis specifically. Now, the easiest way to explain the sensitivity of this is kind of like, as far as I can tell, what they did was, obviously the Genesis had no, thumbstick support originally, so all they've done is duplicate and replicate the effect of the D-pad in the form of a thumbstick. But they also, to make it different, increase the sensitivity. Kind of like when you have a mouse on your PC, you can increase or decrease the sensitivity of it. Just so if you're doing the same movement, it'll move slow. If you increase sensitivity, it moves fast, even though your arm is still doing the same gesture. That's essentially what I think they basically did with the thumbstick here. So with the Genesis, that's really not very helpful. And to be honest, most games that use on the Genesis don't use all 6 buttons. So while there are some, and it's nice to have those there, there's also actual 6-button Genesis controllers. I didn't find the triggers to be particularly useful. Start and select, not really. I mean, it was nice to have the grips on the controller, but aside from that, I don't feel like it really added anything in particular to the Genesis. Now, I have to admit, the Genesis controller is one that I am extraordinarily familiar with. I've been using it, since '93. So I'm very, happy to be holding that particular controller. I'm very comfortable with it. I never really felt the need to upgrade it. So I have to admit that potential bias in my, just in my brain in the process of, being able to play with this stuff. But while this controller didn't necessarily take away from the experience, I can't really say that it added to it. But the Sega Saturn is a different story. I kind of get the feeling that the reason they put both Genesis and Saturn support on the same controller is they built a controller that actually would massively enhance the Saturn experience, but then they also recognized Saturn's just not nearly as popular as Genesis is. So they put both on there in an attempt to sell it to you based on the Genesis when they really kind of built it with the Saturn in mind. Now that's pure speculation, but the reason I think that is when I played this on the Saturn, that was totally a different thing. That was an upgraded experience because I'm going to be honest with you, the Saturn controllers, the 2 that exist, the main ones, I was never a big fan of. I always felt like it was a weak attempt at upgrading the Genesis controller and just wasn't right for the era in which it was in. The content that they were producing, the games specifically, of course, were much more complicated and needed things like thumbsticks. But as I mentioned before at the beginning of the video, there was only the one 3D style controller that had it, and it really wasn't that good at it. This, however, changes that. I played several games for the Saturn with this, one being like Sega Rally, for example. Never really liked that game all that much. I'm not really that much into racers, and playing it with a D-pad was always kind of frustrating, but with the thumbstick and the increased sensitivity of this, it was like a whole new experience. It was like, oh dude, I can actually play this now. This is a lot of fun. And the same went for Nice. I was playing that for a while. When I would play that originally with the D-pad, I would get too frustrated, because that controller just kind of hurts after a little while, in my opinion. I think it was really meant for when Sega was making that console, it's well known that they thought 2D with 3D elements was the future, so they were probably planning on more platformers and things like that, which is what explains that controller. It's good for fighting games and it's good for 2D platformers, but that's not what the Saturn actually produced as far as game content. This controller massively helps with that problem. It's a much more comfortable controller. I don't feel like my hands start to feel like they're getting arthritis after a little while like they do with the regular Saturn controllers. And the increased sensitivity and thumbstick there, I really feel helped massively upgrade the Saturn experience. The D-pad, like I said, is okay. I think it's better than the actual Saturn D-pad, although I'm sure a lot of people out there would dispute that. The 6 buttons work just fine. They do what they're supposed to do. And ultimately, it performs as a very comfortable controller for the Saturn. I will say, though, that I don't feel that this was actually the best controller that, Retro Fighters has ever made. These two feel just more, I don't know, well-built and more to the point. We built this for the N64 and you can tell. We built this for the NES and you can tell. This one, I don't think that was the goal. Like I said, I think they built it for the Saturn and then just, hey, you know what, make it support Genesis so we can sell some of these. I kind of feel like that was what was behind it. It also feels a little lighter than these, although that might just be, I don't know. Something about it just feels like it's not 100% there. So, can I recommend it? Yes and no. I can recommend it if you're a big fan of the Saturn or if you're looking to play the Saturn, re-experience the Saturn. But if you're looking at this for the Genesis, I'm not sure I can actually say yes to go ahead and do that. But a couple other things that I want to note. One that I found fascinating is, so this thing has the 2 ports on it, right? One for Genesis and one for Saturn. I thought, what the hell, let's plug both of them into each console at the same time. So plug it into the Genesis, plug it into the Saturn. And if you're thinking, I'm going to do that, I've got my consoles next to each other, this is great, I'll replace, the control, I'll have one controller that controls both and just keep it plugged in and I can always just, it doesn't matter. Don't do that. So here's something I learned, and I'll show it to you right now. So basically, when you plug it into one console and you plug it into the other, if you power up one of the consoles, it will send power to the other console and start getting lights flashing, even though the console is off, which can't be good for it. So don't do that. I just showed it to you guys in that footage just so you could see the point of what I was talking about, but that clearly can't be good for it. So don't do that. I guess when it comes to this thing, I recommend it as a Saturn controller. I will also say that I feel like it was a bit of maybe there was a hardware reason you couldn't do this, but I'm guessing there wasn't. This should have also just had a USB, cable hanging off of it. That way it would also support everything this one does with the mini, Mac, PC, and Switch. Like this NES one, as I mentioned before, already does that. It has NES and USB on board. To me, it screams of like we're trying to sell the same controller twice, which could very well be the case. But because it, in my opinion, doesn't really work all that well with the Genesis, it works, you can play it, it's just not an improvement over the original. I feel like the additional value to it would have been a USB connection so that you get everything that both of them do in just one purchase. That's kind of what I feel like they should have done. And the same would apply to the Brawler for the N64 as well. It would be nice if they kind of stuck with this route, but I think they're probably not doing that just because they can sell the same controller twice as opposed to just once. Just my guess. But yeah, that'll do it. So thank you very much to Castlemania Games for hooking me up with this. Thank you guys very much for watching. Please like, comment, subscribe, and all that stuff. Always appreciated. Check the description for all the social media things. Thank you very much, and I'll see you all later.